Welcome to Unit 9 of Introduction to Christian Apologetics. In the book of Acts, we see a really interesting little series of events in chapters 13 and 14. First, in chapter 13, we have the launch of the first Christian foreign missions in the missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas, sent out from the church of Antioch in Syria. They're sent out in one of the first major cities that they arrive in is Antioch in Pisidia. Whenever they go into Pisidia and Antioch, they find the Jewish synagogue there, the community of people who already believed in Yahweh, believed in the law, the Old Testament, the promise of the Messiah, and so on. They went to the synagogue, and based upon the messianic prophecies from the Old Testament, based upon their faith in the Old Testament and the God of the Old Testament, they made an appeal for belief in Jesus Christ, the true Messiah, raised from the dead. But then we go on in chapter 14. And in chapter 14, after Paul and Barnabas has left Pisidian Antioch, they travel along, and about 100 miles down the road, they go into this rural town called Lystra. And in Lystra, there's no synagogue. In Lystra, there is, as far as we know, no believing community. We only know of one believing family in Lystra, which was the family of Timothy, who would later become one of Paul's disciples. But other than Timothy and his believing family, we don't know of any worshiping community based upon the Old Testament scriptures there. So how is Paul going to appeal to them for belief in Jesus as the Savior? What Paul does instead in chapter 14 in Lystra is he makes a different kind of appeal, a different kind of sermon. He makes a sermon which is not based upon the messianic prophecies and the fulfillment of Old Testament scriptures, but instead he preaches a sermon based upon common experience that he had with them as human beings living in a world created by God, and all the ways that God has revealed himself in our world. And then based off of that common experience, he reasons his way to telling them it is the God who sent Jesus Christ, the God who came down to this earth in Jesus Christ, who gave us all of these good things that we experience in life. It was this God, and was not, in fact, the worthless idols that you have been worshiping. These are so interesting because here what we see Paul doing, we also see him doing something very similar in Acts 17. What we see Paul doing is adjusting the way that he preaches the gospel based upon the context that he is in. Notice he doesn't change the gospel. He doesn't change the good news, but he repackages it. It's the same gift in a different wrapping, so to say, based upon where he finds himself. Here we find the basis for doing contextualization. Contextualization is whenever we, based upon the context that we are serving or speaking into, shape the way that we form our persuasion for belief in the gospel. Another passage that we see this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. Paul says, "Although I am free from all and not anyone's slave, I have made myself a slave to everyone, in order to win more people. To the Jews I became like a Jew, to win Jews. To those under the law, like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. To those who are without the law, like one without the law, though I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ, to win those without the law. To the weak I became weak, in order to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that I may by every possible means save some. No, I do all this because of the gospel, so that I may share in the blessings." This wonderful, winsome practice that we see in Paul of contextualization of the message and of how he engages with each community is what we are going to be learning about this week in Unit 9. We're going to be learning about contextualization and how to start to do contextualization by discerning the cultural assumptions and plausibility structures of the context that we find ourselves in. So your assignments for this week are to read chapter 9 and to do the quiz based on your reading in chapter 9. Let me give you a heads up. Essay set number 2 is due next week. I hope that you have already been preparing for it, to put some good, diligent work into this assignment. If you have not begun to work on that yet, let me highly encourage you to start working on it now. In this chapter, we are finishing part 2, which is the theological structure of the house that we're building for apologetics at the cross. Essay set number 2 is based upon everything that you have been learning about in part 2 of your textbook, about contextualization, apologetic methodology, the importance of character and humility in doing apologetics. These are the things that you'll be writing about in your essay set. If you have not begun on that yet, let me highly encourage you to start now. This is so important because contextualization is what makes the difference between an interesting lecture and an effective persuasion for the gospel. Let me encourage you guys. What my hope is for you this week through the reading that you do in this chapter and the ongoing development that comes in your life after reading this chapter and after this course is that you would become Christian leaders and missionaries who, like Paul, learn how to read the context, whether that's a culture or whether that's an individual that you are speaking to, and contextualize your message for that context. Let's jump in.